Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Sunday service. For those of you that I have not yet met, my name is Chandrika. On behalf of all of the wonderful souls offering music and song and technical support and greetings and food and all the myriad ways that people serve to offer Sunday service, it's my joy to welcome you and to share this event with you. We'll start with readings from the Rays of the One Light, weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, written by Swami Kriyananda. This week's topic, ego, friend or foe. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. Jesus Christ begins his Beatitudes with the words, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." To be poor in spirit in such a way as to merit the kingdom of heaven doesn't mean to be poor-spirited. Rather, it means to see oneself as owning nothing, since all belongs to God. For all is a manifestation of His consciousness. St. John of the Cross wrote, "If you would own everything, seek to own nothing." That which the ego relinquishes, offering it up to soul consciousness, is reclaimed forever in cosmic consciousness. Nothing is ever lost. Paramhansa Yogananda tells a story in the autobiography of a yogi of the levitating saint Baduri Mahashaya. "Master," said a disciple of the saint once ardently, "you are wonderful. You have renounced riches and comforts to seek God and to teach us wisdom." It was a well-known fact that Baduri Mahashaya had forsaken great family wealth in his early childhood, and when single-mindedly he entered the yogic path. "You were reversing the case," the saint's face held mild rebuke. "I have left a few paltry rupees, a few petty pleasures, for a cosmic empire of endless bliss. How then have I denied myself anything? I know the joy of sharing the treasure." Is that a sacrifice? The short-sighted worldly folk are verily the real renunciates. They relinquish an unparalleled divine possession for a poor handful of earthly toys. The Bhagavad Gita in the 3rd chapter states, "All things are everywhere by nature wrought, in interaction of the qualities. The fool, cheated by self, thinks, 'This I did, and that I wrought.' But thou strong-armed prince, a better lessoned mind, knowing the play of visible things within the world of sense, and how the qualities must qualify, standeth aloof even from his acts." Thus through Holy Scripture God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om. And now we're reading from Whispers from Eternity, Prayer Demands by Paramhansa Yogananda. This demand is entitled, Demand not to be enslaved by the ego or by ego-centered passivity. I want to use my own will, but guide it ever, Father, toward the golden paradise of all fulfillment. For I would be infinity's smiling child, confident of being imprisoned no longer behind bars of fruitless desire and withered hopes. I would break the shameful cords of lethargy that have presumed to hold me, and step fearlessly into freedom. Released, I now blaze my way through forest of every limitation and delusion. Oh, my little vain ego may strut proudly saying, Behold my glory, worship me. But I will look through its transparent form and behold thy unimaginable beauty clothed in the subtle form of the whole universe. The silence-tuned hearing of my soul will ignore that tiny, boasting masquerader, my little self impersonating thee, and I will listen rapturously to the wind-born, fragrant music of thine own matchless voice, whispering across the ages, I am he. Well, today's topic, ego, friend or foe, is one of those situations where it's a trick question. Oftentimes on the spiritual path, we're faced with trick questions because it's not necessarily an either or. It's a both and. In other words, a strong ego, an individual who has strength in their self, and courage, and fortitude, and a curiosity to know the divine, that is a helpful friend along the spiritual path. And in fact, oftentimes is what propels us to seek the spiritual path in the first place. The delusionment of the egoic interactions with the world itself and the constant disappointments and the constant desires that once we fulfill one, we need to fulfill another. That aspect of the ego is more troublesome and becomes our foe. And in fact, in the spiritual path, the last foe that we need to overcome is the ego itself. We need to surrender into a greater flow of consciousness, our sense of self, our sense of self-absorption. Yogananda calls the ego the soul identified with the particular body. And so when the soul enters into our physical being at birth, we then have this aspect of, it comes with all this pool of past karma and emotions and personality traits and quirks, etc., that sometimes get in the way of being able to know God. Another definition that Swami Kriyananda told us about the ego is it's a package of self-definitions. We are this, we are that, we are not this. We can do certain things, we can't do other things. We have a tendency, the ego has a tendency to limit its abilities. It doesn't see itself as the child of the infinite. And so part of our spiritual quest is to learn how to do so. Now, in the readings, sometimes it's intriguing to me because when St. John of the Cross says to us, if you seek to have everything, seek to have nothing. Well, the first part of that statement, seek to have everything, that makes me tremble in my boots. I don't want the responsibility of having everything. At least that's what my ego says. It's just a matter of another things to take care of. And there's a beautiful story of Sri Yukteswar, and of course, as a guru, he received many gifts from his devotees. And he would graciously receive them, and he would graciously take care of them, be the steward of those gifts. But some of his closest disciples, when those gifts wore out or broke, would know that he was relieved to not have the responsibility of continuing to care for that particular item or other items. He wanted to be free and non-attached. And of course, he could rise above the attachments that we might have for, that gift was given to me and it's so precious, etc., because he lived in the reality of the greatest gift of all, the gift of living in union with the divine. And so when we think about this idea of, how do we receive everything and seek nothing, the other part of that statement is seek to own nothing. Well, I don't know about you, but when I go for as simple a thing as a walk by the river, I've got my little backpack and I've got a bottle of water, I've got the sunscreen, I've got a hat to put on, I might have, a ground cover to sit on in case it's, kind of can't find a chair. All these little things that come along with you. So the concept of owning nothing is equally terrifying to the ego. But the soul knows that God provides everything. We simply have to convince ourselves that we can be bigger than our sense of limitations. And one of the things that I've always admired about the spiritual path, and this is looking backwards, because I've always enjoyed epic stories, the stories, the tales of good and evil, and the individuals who, set forth. And, they didn't set forth to conquer evil, they just set forth for some smaller thing. But anyways, looking at these various stories, there's threads that seem to come together in them. Themes that seem to run through all of them. In one of the stories, there is a group of people, and they are nomads. They travel from place to place. They do not have a set home, a set nation. They go from location to location. And when they go, every sentient being that they encounter, they ask, do you know the song? You're seeking for the song. Do you know the song? And oftentimes the individuals they encounter, if they know the ceremony, but they don't know the song, they will say, I am sorry, seeker, I do not know the song, but may you find the song on your journey. And in another tale, there's a story of the Undying Lands. And the story is that the individuals who set sail for the Undying Land, when they approach the land, and the sky will open and the divine light, or the light, will shine forth. And there will be a beautiful song that they know in their soul. They can't remember it in the conscious world. But when they sail for the Undying Land, they know and sing the song rapturously, joyfully, as they enter into the transformative light. Now, do those things sound familiar? Not the stories. Don't worry about what tale did that come from. But as a spiritual seeker, does that sound familiar? Could it be that the song that we're seeking is the sound of Om vibrating through all eternity? Could it be that what we're looking for is the emergence of our own soul into the divine light and the ability to be one with that light and to share that light with others wherever we are in the world? See, we are all individually on an epic journey. You didn't realize that maybe, but at the same time, we really are. And so you get to be the hero or the villain of your own story. in your own search for God. And in some cases, we're both. Because one of the things that's interesting about the spiritual journey is the fact that we choose. A friend of mine, I heard her talking recently, and she described the ego as the first responder. Does that sound familiar? Whenever you're faced with a circumstance or a situation or something, who steps forward first? If you're lucky, it's the soul. But for most of us, the first thing that steps forward is the ego. And then sometimes it gets it right if it's aligned with God's will. I mean, as devotees, we try our best to do that. But sometimes that's not the case. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could pause and let the soul drive the chariot? Let the God spark within us be the first to step forward. And of course, that's part of our journey. It's just learning how to do that more often and not berating ourselves if we're unsuccessful. If sometimes the ego steps forward, well, okay then, you may have a mess that you need to clean up. But it's a learning opportunity, and that too is part of the journey, part of the growth, part of the practice of learning how to overcome our little sense of ego and self-definitions into the greater sense of the flow of God within us. And in these various journeys, we get different kinds of opportunities to learn and grow. And I remember years ago, this was when I was a fledgling. I mean, literally just not even sure yet whether or not I wanted to explore a spiritual path. But I was at my wit's end, as far as struggling with stress and struggling with, depression over the world, and things didn't seem to be going well, and why is everything so difficult, and what in the world happened to joy? Where was that? And so I started seeking. And one day it was a Friday afternoon, I was in my office. And while I was in my office, one of my coworkers stepped in, and as I was gathering up my overnight bag to leave the office a little early to head up to the expanding light. And I was so new on this concept of seeking out anything spiritual that, I just didn't want to go there with anybody. I wasn't going to tell anybody anything about what I was trying. And she very friendly, in a friendly way, said, "Oh, well, where are you going?" And I knew that she meant that as simply a friendly question. But you know how sometimes you have these moments where everything stops and you see all sorts of things happening at the same time. So she asked me a simple question, and I wanted to answer her in a, friendly and constructive way. And my mind was starting to have this conversation. Well, I can't tell her the real place I'm going, and I don't want her to know that I'm looking at a spiritual path and I'm practicing meditation and I'm learning, from a Hindu teacher. I mean, I can't say that. But what can I tell her that would be, respond in kind to her kindness of just being interested? And while my mind was having that conversation, trying to figure out what to say, I heard myself say something. And I said, "I'm going home." Now you can imagine, she looked at me and I could tell I offended her. I mean, part of me observed the fact that it's like, well, you don't want to tell me, and she turned on her heel and walked out of my office. And I recognized that it was like, whoops, that's not what I meant to do. But I was more stunned than she was. I literally looked over my shoulder to say, who in the heck said that? What do you mean I am going home? Who are you and what are you doing speaking from my body? Saying words that I hadn't agreed to say yet. I am going home. And so I grabbed up my things kind of in a confusion, because we all know that we have different aspects within our being. And sometimes, like the previous conversations internally, saying, well, what can we safely tell her? Sometimes the soul makes itself known. Usually in more subtle ways than speaking behind me and saying things out loud that I didn't even know. But nonetheless, we all know what it's like to have the soul give us nudges and hints and to perk us up and to indicate, go this way, do this instead. So all the way in my drive from my office up to the expanding light, I was observing my consciousness. And it was like I was in the middle of a big, what do you call them, like a convention hall. And all the different aspects of my personality and the ways of being and habits, etc., were gathered in this convention hall. And there was chaos there. You could just imagine this was the first time that I had had a sense of who was that voice. And that was the key question they were all asking. But interestingly, a few, a very precious few, perked up their ears. And these were the more noble qualities within me. And they perked up their ears to listen, hoping that that voice would speak again, that that voice would give even clearer message to what in the world, what did this mean? I'm going home. And those few stood silently, and they glanced meaningfully at each other, because they knew at last that the soul had decided to make itself known. See, these noble qualities had previously tried to bring forth and rally the masses into something that would help us overcome the pain and suffering that had been my previous experience. But to no avail, no progress was being made. And those qualities recognized the soul and the reflection of God within that animates each and every one of us. So their ears perked up, and they waited, and they listened, and they watched for their opportunities to help support that particular message, to go along for the ride. Because, of course, the soul wasn't just saying, I, the soul, am going home. The soul was saying, we are all going home. Some of you are going to go home kicking and screaming, but we are all going to get back home to God. I'm sorry, I'm not pointing at anybody in case you were wondering. I'm just, in general, the voices in that particular convention hall, some of them are going to come, kicking and screaming, but they are eventually going to find their way home to God. And why? Because we're learning to bring the divine light into our being. We were learning to surrender our egoic self into something larger, into the presence of God. And there's this beautiful song that Swami Kriyananda wrote, and some consider it his signature song. It's called Love is a Magician. And I want to read some of the lyrics, and I want to make sure I get this right, so I'm going to read from it. And this particular song is essentially about the epic journey of the soul and the ego, and their constant conflict, their constant push and pull, and how to overcome the egoic tendency. Too long I did stray, flung lifetimes away. Can you imagine? Lifetimes we threw away. And of course, we sometimes, if we're having a hard day or a hard week and we didn't meditate as often or as deeply as we wanted, or if we made a mistake in how we interacted with somebody and we weren't our highest self, or we did something out of a habit that wasn't the highest expression that we're capable of, we sometimes go home and then feel bad that, we blew it. Lifetimes. And such is the journey of the soul. This is not an easy recovery journey. This is not a journey that happens for most of us easily. We have to work at it. Flung lifetimes away, imagined that you did not care, speaking to God, imagining that God did not care for this expression of the egoic child, the child of God in our greater reality. And later in the song, only love can heal all the pain I feel. What a fool was I to turn away. What a fool was I to turn away. Representing the ego not being willing to turn towards God and to accept that loving, healing presence that is truly our birthright as children of the light, as children of love. And so this is a wonderful reminder of a greater reality than what we sometimes limit ourselves to. I'm going to close with some excerpts from the poem Samadhi, a poem that Yogananda wrote on the subway. And some of these passages seem to speak to me about this conflict, age-long conflict of the ego and the soul in our journey back to God. Beyond the limits of the mortal frame, to farthest boundary of eternity, where I, the cosmic sea, watch the little ego floating in me. Myself in everything enters the great myself. Gone forever, fitful, flickering shadows of mortal memory. Spotless is my mental sky, below, ahead, and high above. Eternity and I, one united ray. A tiny bubble of laughter. I am become the sea of mirth itself. And God bless you all in your journey, your epic journey to your home in God.